Hello everyone, welcome back. Are you ready for another Bible study? I think that I am. Let's talk about Deuteronomy chapter 14 today. As always, this PDF is available at the link in the description on our website for free. Deuteronomy 14, when did these events happen in history? Well, we're right around 1450 BC, right before the nation of Israel crosses the Jordan River and goes into the Promised Land, where they're going to live for the next several centuries. In terms of our characters, we've got those Israelites. They're also known as Hebrews sometimes in the Old Testament. They're a large nation of people. They're the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who we read about back in the book of Genesis. We've got Moses, who's the leader of the Israelites, and he's led them all the way to the borders of Canaan, led them out of Egypt through the wilderness, now to the Promised Land. We've also got some kind of new characters. We got the Levites. Now, the Levites were one of the 12 tribes of Israel, and God specifically called them to a special role. They served God in a special way, caring for the tabernacle and the holy items that were contained within it. And then we're also going to talk about sojourners very briefly in this chapter. I just wanted to give you an idea of who they were. The Bible uses the word strangers or sojourners to describe foreigners. So these are people who were not descendants of the 12 sons of Jacob, but who lived amongst the Israelites, both in the wilderness and in the land of Canaan. And then as far as our map goes, things haven't changed. Moses is still talking to the Israelites in Moab, near Mount Pisgah. Now over to our outline. I think Deuteronomy chapter 14 is an interesting chapter. It talks about the dietary restrictions of the Israelites, the clean and the unclean animals as they are known. This is the majority of the chapter, verses 1 through 21. So as you may remember if you did the book of Leviticus study with us, specifically Leviticus chapter 11, God's law limited the kinds of animals that the Israelites were allowed to eat. In Deuteronomy chapter 14, here in this chapter, Moses is reminding this new generation of Israelites about God's instructions on these matters so that they don't forget them, so that they continue to do them while they're living in Canaan. So let's talk about some of these restrictions. The people of Israel were allowed to eat animals that chewed the cud and had cloven hoofs. If you don't know what it means to chew the cud, it's like an animal that chews its food, swallows it, and then spits it back up and chews it again. It's a really pleasant image to think about. So an animal had to chew the cud and have a cloven hoof or a split hoof. And if that was the case, then the Israelites could eat them. If an animal chewed the cud but didn't have a cloven hoof, or vice versa, the Israelites were not allowed to eat them. And these restricted animals were known as, quote, unclean animals. Now, in terms of aquatic life, things that lived in the water, Israelites were allowed to eat any animal that had both fins and scales, right? But if it didn't have fins and scales, we're not allowed to eat it. Of the birds, Israelites were forbidden from eating, here's the list: the eagle, the bearded vulture, the black vulture, the kite, the falcon of any kind, every raven of any kind, the ostrich, the nighthawk, the seagull, the hawk of any kind, the little owl, the short-eared owl, the barn owl, the tawny owl, the carrion vulture, and the cormorant, the stork, the heron of any kind, the hoopoe, and the bat. Verses 12 through 18. So, I think that list is fine with me. I've never really had a desire to eat a seagull or a bat, although they used to eat bats in Guam, where I used to live. Not so much nowadays, but they used to a couple generations back. Okay, so all winged insects were to be considered unclean to the Israelites, except for the exception that was made in Leviticus chapter 11, verse 21. We'll talk about that in our applications section. And finally, the Israelites were not allowed to eat anything that died naturally. Okay, so if they found a deer that had died naturally out in the field, they weren't allowed to take it home and cook it up and eat it. So that's what we have as far as dietary restrictions in chapter 14. Now let's talk about tithes, verses 22 through 29. So the people of Israel were required under God's law to tithe a portion of their harvest to God. A tithe is like a percentage of what you make. A portion of that was to be dedicated to God. When they entered the land of Canaan, they were to bring their tithes to God's appointed place of worship, which we talked about a couple of chapters ago. God was going to appoint a special place where all worship was going to happen. They're supposed to bring their tithes there. But if they lived far away from God's appointed place, God made a provision for them. They were allowed to bring their tithe to God's holy place in the form of money. so they could convert it to money and bring that. That's a lot easier than bringing, a big old wagon of grain or something like that. The Israelites were reminded not to neglect the Levites who lived amongst them, because you remember the tribe of Levi was special, as we talked about in our character section. They didn't receive a land inheritance like the other tribes. So the other tribes were supposed to remember them, not to neglect them and their needs. Now, at the end of every 3 years, we're told, the people were to bring their tithes to their town and to share them with the Levites, the sojourners, the orphans, and the widows, anyone in need. All right, so that is Deuteronomy chapter 14, dietary restrictions and tithing. Now let's talk about our application. This chapter gives us an excellent example of why the Bible needs to be read comprehensively. You'll remember, we just covered in verse 19 of this chapter, Moses told the people that all winged insects were off limits to them. They weren't allowed to eat them. Why then, when you get to the New Testament and you're introduced to a guy named John the Baptist, who was a prophet of God, why are we told specifically that he ate locusts as part of his diet? Because if you didn't know, locusts are a type of winged insect. So how did he get away with that? Did he just ignore God's law? Was he just being disobedient to God? How's that work? Wasn't he breaking the laws that Moses gave to the people? We find the explanation to this dilemma when we look back at the details that were given in Leviticus chapter 11. So we need to take both chapters into account. In Leviticus 11:21, Moses gave an exception to the prohibition against winged insects, saying, quote, "You may eat those that have jointed legs above their feet, which hop on the ground." Right? Locusts, they kind of look like giant grasshoppers. Right? Their legs come up and they're jointed above their feet. And then they come back down, grasshopper legs, they hop on the ground too, right? So they fall into this exception. So when we find, the application for us is that when we find something that appears to be inconsistent or problematic in the Bible, one of the best ways to resolve our concerns is to just finish reading the book. And a lot of our questions will be answered if we just gather all of the details. We must read the whole story to get all of the details, and many, quote, problematic passages will work themselves out as we continue to read God's story. This is a little bit of a rant. It'll probably take us over 5 minutes, but this is one of the major problems I see with the way that people use the Bible today. Is like they just want to grab a passage and say, critics of the Bible, grab a passage out of the text. Maybe it's a sentence, maybe it's a phrase, maybe it's a whole paragraph, and they say, look at this. This doesn't make any sense. It's like, well, wait a second. Have you read the rest of the story? Do you know how this fits into the larger story? Because you know what somebody would never do? They'd never go to a novel or, let's use a novel, for example. Go to a random page in a random chapter and pull out a paragraph or a sentence and be like, look, this doesn't make sense. This is illogical. If somebody did that, you'd be like, but have you read the rest of the book? Do you know if the author reveals like more information about this later? Do you know how the book ends? Do you know all the details? You'd say, you're making a useless point in this criticism because you haven't read the rest of the book. Well, the same is true for the story of the Bible. The more I study the Bible, the more I become convinced that it's something that needs to be read as a whole story rather than something that we pick apart paragraph by paragraph, sentence by sentence, pull certain things out of the text and use them however we want to use them or criticize them however we want to criticize them. We need to look at it as an entire story. And so if somebody has a criticism about a particular piece of it, we need to ask them, but have you read how this fits into the larger story of what God's saying? And this is also why we ourselves need to know the story, is so that in some cases we can help these people to understand what God is actually saying and how all these pieces fit together and how the story begins and how the plot carries and how it concludes in the end. So read the Bible comprehensively. That's the application. Read it as one complete unit, and that will explain and help work through a lot of the problems that may come up in just reading one particular section.